Easy does it with that one, Corporal.
Yes, sir. These documents are vital.
May 10th, 1945. Just 3 days after Germany's unconditional surrender, the war in Europe was supposed to be over. The guns had gone silent, cities lay in ruins, and the swastika had fallen. Across Germany, shattered divisions marched into captivity. Weary men stripped of rank, medals, and purpose. But inside one quiet American interrogation center in the Bavarian countryside, the war was not finished. It had merely gone underground. Behind the guarded gates of an unmarked compound known only to U.S. Army intelligence, a group of captured German officers were told they would not be sent to a prison camp. Instead, they were to remain in what seemed like a country estate, with clean beds, warm food, and cigarettes on the tables. What they did not know was that the walls themselves were listening. Every conversation, every sigh, every whispered confession was recorded by hidden microphones installed inside lamps, walls, even water pipes. The Americans called it the P.O. Box 1142 program. It was designed to extract secrets not by torture or interrogation, but by trust, by letting the prisoners believe they were safe among their own kind. Some of the men had commanded U-boats that sent convoys to the bottom of the Atlantic. Others had overseen rocket programs that rained fire on London. Among them were officers of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, who carried secrets Hitler had ordered destroyed before capture. At first, they spoke freely about fuel shortages, failed orders, and the chaos of Berlin's final days. But as the days passed, the mood changed. They began to sense something unnatural about the place. The staff's politeness felt rehearsed. The radio played only approved broadcasts. The rooms were identical, down to the placement of the pencils on the desks. When one officer complained about the missing mail from his family, another remarked that even the post seemed to have ears. In the surveillance room below, American intelligence officers listened through headphones, cataloging every word. What they were hearing was not mere military chatter. It was the sound of an empire dying in slow confession. And buried within those recordings were fragments of something the Allies had not expected. Evidence of secret Nazi networks planning to rise again from the ruins. The war, it turned out, had only shifted from battlefields to shadows. The transcripts began to reveal a chilling pattern. In conversations between officers who thought they were speaking privately, fragments of coded language appeared. References to the organization, the files in the Alps, and the new orders from Madrid. Analysts cross-referenced these with captured documents and discovered a clandestine network that had survived Germany's surrender. Its members were scientists, SS intelligence agents, and industrialists who refused to accept defeat. They called their plan der Spinne, the spider. Its purpose, to ensure that the ideas of the Third Reich would live on long after its armies had fallen. The Americans listening at P.O. Box 1142 realized they were not merely dealing with broken men, but with architects of a hidden war. In hushed tones, the prisoners spoke of safe houses in Argentina, caches of gold smuggled through Switzerland, and lists of names that would allow them to rebuild when the world had forgotten. Some even claimed that Hitler's death was not as straightforward as the Allied press insisted, that his most loyal followers had already begun to erase his trail, creating myths to outlive him. The more the officers spoke, the clearer it became that surrender had been only a tactic. Late one night, 2 colonels from the Wehrmacht's intelligence division began debating the American interrogation methods. One said the Americans were too soft, that they wanted confession without confrontation. The other laughed quietly and replied, "They don't need to ask. We're telling them everything ourselves." His words sent a shiver through the analysts on the other side of the wall. It was true. Without a single question, the microphones were capturing the anatomy of a surviving ideology, a network that would later shape the early architecture of post-war espionage. By the end of that month, the transcripts filled hundreds of pages. Within them, names like Skorzeny, Galen, and Bormann surfaced repeatedly, men who had either disappeared or been presumed dead. To the Americans, these were ghosts of a regime they thought destroyed. But to those listening at Fort Hunt, Virginia, where the intelligence was sent for analysis, the ghosts were becoming alarmingly real. The lines between defeated enemy and potential ally began to blur as Washington's attention turned from the ruins of Berlin to the growing shadow of Moscow. The Cold War was being born, and in its first breath, it whispered with a German accent. In a secluded interrogation chamber deep within the compound, one prisoner stood apart from the rest. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, former head of German Army intelligence on the Eastern Front. He was a quiet man with piercing eyes and the calm detachment of someone who understood both defeat and opportunity. When he was first brought in, Gehlen carried no documents, no insignia, only a single steel case buried in a Bavarian forest containing microfilm reels of Soviet intelligence maps, names, and networks. He told his American captors nothing of its contents at first, but when he finally spoke, it was not as a prisoner. It was as a strategist offering his services to a new master. He explained that his files held the only comprehensive intelligence on the Soviet Union's military infrastructure, knowledge that even the Americans lacked, and he offered it freely, under one condition: protection for himself and his men, and the chance to continue their work, not for Germany, but for the United States. It was an audacious proposal, but the timing was perfect. Washington was desperate for eyes behind the Iron Curtain, and Gehlen offered them an instant network, trained agents, informants, and moles already positioned across Eastern Europe. When news of Gehlen's proposition reached Washington, it caused a quiet storm within the intelligence community. Officially, the Third Reich was to be dismantled, its ideology erased. But privately, the U.S. Army's G2 division saw immense value in Gehlen's archive. The Soviets were no longer allies. They were the next enemy. To outwit them, America would need to borrow the very tools that Hitler had forged for his own dark empire. Within months, Gehlen was flown secretly to Washington under a false identity. There, he met with top officials who approved what would become one of the most controversial bargains of the 20th century, Operation Rusty, later known as the Gehlen Organization. By 1946, hundreds of former Nazi intelligence officers were quietly put back to work, not in uniform, but under American supervision. Their mission was to map Soviet expansion, infiltrate communist cells, and build the foundations of post-war espionage. But beneath this alliance, a moral corrosion began to spread. Many of these men were implicated in war crimes. Files that could have condemned them simply vanished, buried beneath layers of new secrecy. What began as intelligence cooperation soon turned into a trade, one in which truth was the first casualty and justice the second. The compound in Bavaria had become more than a holding site. It was now a laboratory of deception. Every day, American officers observed their captives' behavior, testing subtle psychological techniques that would later define Cold War intelligence. Conversations were manipulated through controlled rumors, fake broadcasts, and forged letters allegedly from relatives in Allied custody. Even the temperature and lighting were altered to provoke emotional responses. What began as an effort to collect information had transformed into a silent experiment in the breaking and rebuilding of human loyalty. One morning, 2 Luftwaffe officers received a newspaper showing photographs of Soviet troops marching through Berlin. The paper was genuine, but the date was not. It had been printed weeks earlier, designed to make the prisoners believe that entire sections of Germany had already fallen before their final surrender. The psychological impact was immediate. That evening they spoke of betrayal, of how the High Command had lied, how the SS had fled, and how perhaps, one of them whispered, the Americans are not our enemies after all. The microphones captured everything. Meanwhile, in the hidden listening rooms, analysts began to categorize emotional triggers: despair, nostalgia, guilt, each one tied to confessions of strategic value. They learned that guilt produced details about atrocities, but nostalgia revealed networks, hidden roots, and surviving loyalties. It was not brute force that opened the mind. It was the illusion of comfort. The methods were refined, documented, and later shared with other Allied intelligence agencies, quietly shaping interrogation doctrines for decades to come. Among the recordings recovered from that period is one particularly haunting exchange between 2 naval officers. One recalls sinking a ship full of refugees in the Baltic, believing it carried Soviet troops. His companion remained silent for a long time before saying, "Do you think they'll hang us for that?" The first man replies, "No, they'll use us. They already are." The tape ends there, but the words became a grim prophecy. Within a year, many of these officers, men once condemned as war criminals, were quietly moved into secret employment under Galen's expanding organization. Their interrogations had become their interviews. Their confessions had become resumes. And in the race against Soviet power, morality was now a luxury few in Washington were willing to afford. By 1947, the world had entered a new and uneasy silence. Europe was rebuilding, but beneath its ruins, an invisible war had begun. Former Nazi officers, once hunted, were now working in the shadows, not for Germany, but for their former enemies. The Galen organization operated from a discreet office in Pullach, near Munich, under the guise of a research institute. Inside, the corridors echoed with typewriters, coded messages, and maps of Soviet territories pinned across entire walls. Files marked top secret were stamped not with swastikas, but with the emblem of a new order, an alliance of necessity born from fear of the East. What the public never knew was that the American intelligence community had inherited not just Galen's files, but his methods. Surveillance, double agents, and disinformation campaigns became the instruments of this emerging Cold War. Many of Galen's men had served in the Reich Main Security Office, the same branch that had overseen mass deportations and executions. Yet now, their expertise was repurposed to monitor communist activity across Eastern Europe. The moral dissonance was staggering. Men responsible for crimes against humanity were writing the intelligence reports that shaped Western policy. At Fort Hunt, analysts noticed that their German assets often held back key information. Galen was no exception. He controlled access to his network like a merchant guarding treasure, revealing only what ensured his indispensability. Each revelation was calculated. A piece of Soviet data here, a captured agent there, enough to prove his value, but never the full picture. The Americans tolerated this, believing they could manage him. In truth, Galen was already rebuilding his own power structure, one that would outlast its American sponsors. Meanwhile, within the same compound where it had all begun, other German officers who had been recruited were being quietly transported elsewhere. Some disappeared into obscure camps, others were transferred to Britain or France for questioning. A few were handed over to the Soviets, their fates sealed. Those who remained in American custody heard rumors of a coming purge, a quiet liquidation of prisoners whose knowledge was no longer useful. They whispered about trucks arriving at night, about empty cells in the morning. None of it was ever confirmed, but the paranoia was enough to make them talk. And every confession, every nervous word, became another thread in the web of secrets that America was spinning from the ashes of the Reich. By the winter of 1948, the fragile alliance between American intelligence and its former enemies had grown into a machine of secrecy too vast to control. In the quiet outskirts of Pullach, where Galen's organization thrived under a false civilian identity, shipments of documents began arriving under armed guard. Entire archives smuggled out of occupied zones. Among them were files on Soviet military structure, resistance networks, and covert operations. But buried deep within the same crates were darker materials, dossiers from the Gestapo and SS archives, filled with names, interrogation methods, and detailed studies of human endurance under psychological stress. American analysts handling these documents began to notice patterns. Some of the so-called Soviet intelligence data bore eerie similarities to Nazi-era experiments on prisoners of war and concentration camp victims. Records of hypothermia exposure, sensory deprivation, and induced trauma appeared in reports presented as scientific intelligence. Though officially classified, these documents quietly influenced research divisions within the U.S. military and intelligence services, shaping early Cold War programs later known as Project Bluebird and MK-Ultra. The legacy of the Reich was mutating, absorbed not as ideology, but as methodology. Inside the compound, German officers who once feared execution now found themselves living comfortably. Paid salaries, freedom of movement, even family visits. The irony was inescapable. Men who had orchestrated destruction now dined under American protection, convinced that their knowledge had purchased redemption. Some boasted of their new purpose, claiming they were now serving civilization against the Bolshevik threat. Others were haunted, unable to reconcile their complicity. One prisoner, a former SS intelligence captain, was overheard murmuring that Hell Sid implied changed uniforms. The microphones caught every word. In Washington, high-ranking officials debated the ethics of their arrangement. Reports warned that Galen's organization was infiltrated by former SS officers and Nazi loyalists who used American funding to rebuild personal networks. But the tide of fear was stronger than conscience. The Soviet blockade of Berlin had begun. Stalin's armies stood across the Iron Curtain. To many in power, the past no longer mattered. Only survival did. Thus, the experiment that began as an interrogation had evolved into a partnership built on denial. The Americans believed they were harnessing knowledge for a new age of intelligence. The Germans believed they were ensuring that their defeat would never be absolute. In the shadows between them, a new kind of war was being born. One fought not with bullets, but with memory, secrecy, and the quiet rewriting of history itself. In 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany was formally established, the Gehlen organization had already become its hidden nervous system. Officially, it did not exist. Yet its reports shaped West Germany's foreign policy, guided U.S. military deployments, and influenced NATO's earliest intelligence strategies. Reinhard Gehlen was no longer a captive. He was a respected ally, his war record sealed, his crimes erased. The Americans viewed him as indispensable, a man who could see into the Soviet mind. But behind the facade of cooperation, the organization was quietly protecting its own. Former SS officers reappeared under new identities, their wartime affiliations buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. Those who had once hunted partisans in Eastern Europe were now collecting information on communist sympathizers in West Berlin. Industrialists who had financed the Nazi regime were discreetly reintegrated into the Western economy through reconstruction programs. Some of the same corporations that produced weapons for the Reich now built engines and electronics for the U.S. military. The machinery of survival had become indistinguishable from the machinery of progress. Inside the walls of Pullach, the old rituals persisted. Staff members greeted each other with subtle phrases, half-sentences that hinted at loyalty to a vanished order. A portrait of a mountain landscape hung in Galen's office. Behind it, a safe containing wartime documents marked Nur für den Führer, for the Führer only. He rarely spoke of the past, yet he preserved it meticulously, as though waiting for a future that might demand its return. Some of his subordinates referred to the office jokingly as the Ghost Ministry, a name that carried more truth than they realized. Meanwhile, American officers stationed nearby began noticing inconsistencies in reports forwarded by their German counterpart. Soviet troop numbers were exaggerated, certain sources unverifiable. It became clear that Galen's men were feeding the West both truths and illusions, shaping perception to secure their indispensability. The more fear they produced, the more valuable they became. When questioned, Gehlen dismissed concerns with calm precision. Intelligence is never pure. It is a reflection of power. By the time the CIA was officially founded in 1947, it had already inherited this moral labyrinth. Galen's methods, manipulation through fear, control through secrecy, seeped into its structure like invisible ink. The men who once swore allegiance to Hitler had, through a quiet pact of necessity, helped design the architecture of the New World Order. The war had ended, but its architects were still drawing the blueprints. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had entered full shadow. The Iron Curtain divided Europe like a scar, and both sides fed on paranoia. Within this climate, the Gehlen organization grew unchecked, its power reinforced by the very fear it cultivated. It became the West's primary source of intelligence on the Soviet Union, its reports cited in Washington briefings, NATO conferences, and even in the Oval Office, yet almost no one questioned where the information truly came from. Behind every Soviet defector or field report, there often stood a man who had once worn the black uniform of the SS. The organization's reach extended far beyond intelligence. Through covert channels, it helped former Nazis escape prosecution by feeding Western agencies fabricated leads on communist threats. In exchange, files disappeared, evidence was misplaced, and names were struck from Allied war crime lists. Operation Paperclip had already brought scientists from Peenemünde and Dachau to American laboratories. Now the same rationale was being applied to spies and assassins. Knowledge, no matter how tainted, was treated as currency. In Pullach, secrecy had become ritual. Visitors passed through layers of security, guards who never spoke, corridors lined with steel doors that led to rooms without windows. Inside those rooms, analysts traced Soviet railway lines, coded intercepts, and political affiliations. But among those reports were also dossiers on Germans themselves, suspected traitors, journalists, and even former resistance members. To Galen, internal control was as essential as external defense. The techniques once used by the Gestapo to preserve ideological purity were being repurposed to ensure loyalty within a democratic state. One chilling account from a declassified memo described a man known only as Agent 72, a former SS interrogator recruited to identify potential Soviet sympathizers in West German universities. His methods were precise and ruthless: surveillance, blackmail, psychological breakdown. Dozens of students were expelled or disappeared, their names erased from records. When questioned years later, he claimed he was simply continuing the work he had always done, protecting the state. The badge on his desk had changed, but the creed behind it had not. In Washington, only a handful of senior officials knew the full extent of this shadow alliance. They justified it as a necessary evil in an age of nuclear tension. But as reports of abuses surfaced, quiet unease began to spread through the ranks. The Americans had built their new intelligence empire on a foundation of ghosts, and the ghosts were beginning to whisper again. By 1954, whispers of unease had turned into classified reports. American oversight committees began noticing strange discrepancies in Galen's intelligence: phantom Soviet divisions that did not exist, inflated troop numbers, false warnings of invasions that never came. Yet every exaggeration produced the same result: more funding, more resources, more dependence on Galen's network. The deception was not accidental. It was systemic. The greater the fear of Moscow, the safer Galen's men became. The Cold War's paranoia had become their shield. Within the Pullach compound, a culture of secrecy bordered on fanaticism. Files were burned weekly, typewriters replaced monthly, and conversations inside the cafeteria were forbidden to mention surnames. Even Galen's American handlers were kept at a distance. When they demanded transparency, his officers responded with calculated indignation, accusing the Americans of betraying the mutual trust that had kept Europe safe. In truth, the organization had long since drifted beyond control. It operated as a state within a state, accountable to no government, loyal only to its own survival. Hidden among the archives were reports on operations the Americans had never authorized. Former Wehrmacht and SS agents were being sent east under forged identities to infiltrate Soviet territory. Many were captured or executed, but their deaths were quietly rewritten as missing in action. Others vanished entirely, resurfacing years later in South America or the Middle East under new names. Through networks that stretched from Munich to Buenos Aires, the Spider, the old Nazi escape apparatus, was thriving again, nourished by money and protection from both sides of the Atlantic. One night in 1955, a young American intelligence officer stationed in Pullach discovered a cache of hidden documents behind a false wall. Inside were hundreds of photographs, not of Soviet facilities, but of concentration camp victims, test subjects, and human experiments conducted under the Reich. The files had been reclassified with new titles: Behavioral Response Studies. The realization was sickening. What had been condemned as atrocity was now preserved as data. When the officer reported his findings, the matter disappeared into classified archives within weeks. By the time Galen officially became head of West Germany's new intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND, in 1956, his transformation was complete. The man once interrogated as a war criminal was now a cornerstone of Western intelligence. The moral line separating past from present had been erased. And though the uniforms were different, the machinery of secrecy remained the same, silent, efficient, and utterly beyond accountability. The year was 1957. Across Europe, the wounds of the Second World War were fading beneath highways, factories, and new flags. But deep within the intelligence archives of both East and West, the war had never ended. It had simply changed languages. Reinhard Gehlen now led an official agency recognized by the West German government, yet his office in Pullack remained eerily unchanged from its wartime origins. The same reinforced doors, the same code rooms, the same men who once pledged loyalty to a dead Führer. Only the mission briefings had different letterheads. Gehlen's organization was now a critical node in NATO's intelligence chain, feeding daily reports to Washington and London. Yet beneath the surface, a silent rot persisted. Declassified memos from U.S. archives revealed that entire categories of intelligence were being manipulated, some invented, others withheld, to shape political outcomes within the new German state. Dossiers were crafted to discredit politicians suspected of being too sympathetic to reunification or too critical of American policy. Even Chancellor Konrad Adenauer was not immune to Gehlen's quiet scrutiny. Files on him, labeled for internal stability purposes, were later found destroyed. At the same time, the BND became a refuge for hundreds of men with blood on their hands. One report lists more than 200 former SS and Gestapo members employed under Gehlen between 1950 and 1958. Many had been involved in the persecution of Jews, partisans, and civilians across occupied Europe, but their records had been sanitized, their new personnel files listing only anti-communist service as justification for employment. Justice was not blind. It was bought, traded, and buried in the name of strategy. Meanwhile, the Soviets had their own ghosts. They captured fragments of the Gehlen network, turned double agents, and spread disinformation through false defectors. The secret war became a hall of mirrors, each side reflecting the other's sins. Files once hidden in German forests now circulated in Moscow under new classifications. Even Hitler's former scientists, smuggled to the West under Operation Paperclip, appeared in Soviet counterintelligence reports. The ideologies had changed, but the methods, control, secrecy, manipulation, remained identical. In one of his rare, candid moments, Gehlen told a visiting American liaison, "The past is not over. It simply works for different employers." The remark, noted in a private memorandum, captured the essence of his world. The Reich had fallen, but its architects still walked freely, not as fugitives, but as founders of a new intelligence empire. And the silence that followed them was the most dangerous weapon of all. By the early 1960s, Reinhard Gehlen had become a phantom statesman, courted by Western leaders, feared by his subordinates, and untouchable by law. His name rarely appeared in newspapers, yet his fingerprints were on nearly every covert operation that shaped post-war Europe. Under his leadership, the BND expanded its reach beyond intelligence into the manipulation of politics itself. Secret funding influenced West German elections, disinformation targeted labor unions and left-wing movements, and dossiers were compiled on journalists who probed too deeply into wartime histories. The architecture of fear had merely adapted to a new democracy. Among the few who dared to challenge him was Fritz Kolbe, a former German diplomat who had risked his life to provide the Allies with intelligence during the war. When Kolbe applied to the new BND in 1951, Gehlen personally rejected him, labeling him a traitor to Germany. Men who had served Hitler were welcomed. The man who had betrayed him was banished. It was a decision that revealed the continuity of an old order hidden within the structures of the new. Gehlen's network was not built on moral rehabilitation. It was built on control. Meanwhile, American intelligence continued to depend on the BND's reports. Entire CIA briefings on Soviet troop movements, nuclear development, and Eastern Bloc politics relied on Gehlen's files. Yet few realized how often those reports were colored by self-preservation and manipulation. When Soviet defectors exposed fabricated data in the early 1960s, Washington quietly dismissed the findings. To question Galen's information was to question the foundation of Western intelligence itself, something no official dared to do during the height of Cold War hysteria. Behind closed doors, Galen's power began to fracture. Younger German officers, educated after the war, viewed his circle of ex-Nazi as a relic of a darker age. Internal memos spoke of a ministry of ghosts, a system sustained by fear rather than function. Even as West Germany prospered, Pollock remained locked in the logic of survival. Suspicion, secrecy, silence. By 1965, scandals began to surface. Missing funds, compromised agents, Soviet moles inside Galen's own network. Yet every revelation was buried under national security. In 1968, after more than 2 decades of operating in the shadows, Reinhard Galen quietly retired. No trials, no confessions, no reckoning. He left behind an empire built from the ruins of 2 worlds, Nazi and Allied, fused into one machinery of control. His final report to the government ended with a single sentence: "Our vigilance preserved freedom." But in the archives he left behind, another truth was waiting: that freedom in his hands had always come at the price of memory. After Galen's retirement, the German intelligence service underwent what officials called a structural cleansing. Yet in truth, little changed. The old guard remained quietly embedded in critical posts, their files sealed by state order. The Pollock compound continued to hum with coded transmissions and courier flights under a new banner, but the ethos of secrecy persisted like an inherited instinct. The Cold War demanded continuity, not reflection. The ghosts had learned to live within the system, unseen, unacknowledged, and essential. In 1971, Reinhard Galen published his memoirs, The Service, the memoirs of General Reinhard Galen, a sanitized account of his life that portrayed him as a reluctant patriot and a guardian against communism. He described his cooperation with the Americans as a noble duty and dismissed his Nazi affiliations as a product of circumstance. Entire chapters omitted the names of men who had built his post-war empire, men whose crimes were well documented but whose records had vanished into Allied and German archives. The public saw a bureaucrat. The files told a different story. Within the CIA, declassified communications from the era reveal growing unease. By the mid-1970s, U.S. analysts privately acknowledged that a significant portion of early Cold War intelligence from the Galen organization had been unreliable or deliberately falsified. One internal report bluntly stated, "We built a mirror of the Reich and called it a safeguard." But the admission came too late. The framework Galen created, the networks, the secrecy, the moral concessions, had already become standard practice across Western intelligence agencies. The infection had become institutional. Meanwhile, fragments of the organization resurfaced in unexpected places. Former agents appeared in South American security forces, in Middle Eastern advisory roles, even in corporate espionage networks. Through the remnants of the spider, they continued to trade information, weapons, and influence. The ideological core of Nazism had fractured, but its operational mindset, the belief that control justifies everything, lived on in 1,000 untraceable ways. When Galen died in 1979, his funeral was small and discreet. No official apologies, no mention of the shadows he had carried across 3 decades. He was buried under a simple cross in Bavaria, his grave unmarked by title or rank. Yet, in intelligence circles, his name endured, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a blueprint. The man who began as a captured enemy had become the silent architect of how nations would conduct their hidden wars for generations. And with him, a part of the past remained forever unburied. Decades later, when the Cold War finally thawed, historians began to unseal the archives. What they found was not merely the story of one man, but the anatomy of a moral compromise that had shaped the second half of the 20th century. The files from Pollock revealed how Western intelligence had been built, in part, upon the bones of the Reich, how the quest for knowledge had eclipsed the need for justice. Reports once marked top secret detailed the recruitment of war criminals, the falsification of Soviet data, and the systematic erasure of guilt. Each page blurred the boundary between victory and corruption. By the 1990s, researchers uncovered documents confirming that more than 4,000 former Nazi officials had worked directly or indirectly for the BND or its allied sponsors during the Cold War. Among them were men responsible for mass executions, deportations, and the administration of concentration camps. Their crimes had not been forgiven, only forgotten under the convenient logic of strategic necessity. When confronted, surviving officials insisted that history should move on, that the choices made were products of their time. But the paper trail spoke otherwise. The moral architecture of the West's intelligence community had been constructed from materials salvaged from its enemy. In 2011, a German government-commissioned study finally confirmed what had long been whispered. The BND's founding generation had been saturated with former Nazis, and the culture of secrecy they created delayed Germany's reckoning with its own past by decades. The files described the atmosphere inside Pullack as one of collective amnesia, where loyalty to the network outweighed loyalty to truth. Some documents had been intentionally destroyed before the investigation began, shredded, burned, or quietly removed. The silence, once weaponized for war, had outlived the men who forged it. Today, the story of those interrogations in 1945, when captured officers believed their war was over, reads like the opening act of a larger deception. The microphones hidden in the walls of that quiet Bavarian villa recorded not just the confessions of defeated soldiers, but the birth of an intelligence order built on the very shadows it sought to fight. From those whispers emerged alliances, agencies, and doctrines that would define global power for the next half-century. The prisoners were right in the end. The war had not ended. It had simply changed its name, its uniform, and its masters, and the world it created would never again be entirely free from its echo.